Good morning, good evening, boys and girls. How are we all doing today? Now, as was so rudely pointed out to me yesterday, I did in fact miss Friday, so we are going to just skip straight towards our bedtime story that was earmarked for today, Saturday. And in celebration of our girl Lizzie's Platinum Jubilee, we are going to read for you a bedtime story called The English Constitution. It's written by Walter Bagehot. Without further ado, let's get started. So, The English Constitution, Chapter 1, The Cabinet. On all great subjects, says Mr. Mill, much remains to be said, and none is this more true than the English Constitution. The literature which has accumulated upon it is huge, but an observer who looks at the living reality will wonder at the contrast to the paper description. He will see in the life much which is not in the books, and he will not find in the rough practice many refinements of the literary theory. It was natural, perhaps inevitable, that such an undergrowth of irrelevant ideas should gather round the British Constitution. Language is the tradition of nations. Each generation describes what it sees, but it uses words transmitted from the past. When a great entity, like the British Constitution, has continued in connected outward sameness, but hidden inner changes, for many ages, every generation inherits a series of inapt words, of maxims once true, but of which the truth is ceasing or has ceased. As a man's family go on muttering in his maturity incorrect phrases derived from a just observation of his early youth, so in the full activity of an historical constitution, its subjects repeat phrases true in the time of their fathers and inculcated by those fathers, but now true no longer. Or, if I may say so, an ancient and ever-altering constitution is like an old man who still wears, with attached fondness, clothes in the fashion of his youth. What you see of him is the same, what you do not see is wholly altered. There are two descriptions of the English Constitution which have exercised immense influence, but which are erroneous. First, it is laid down as a principle of the English polity that in it the legislative, the executive, and the judicial powers are quite divided, that each is entrusted to a separate person or set of persons, that no one of these can at all interfere with the work of the other. There has been much eloquence expended in explaining how the rough genius of the English people, even in the Middle Ages, when it was especially rude, carried into life and practice that elaborate division of functions which philosophers had suggested on paper, but which they had hardly hoped to see except on paper. Just a little bit of tea. It is the English Constitution, therefore we must have tea. Secondly, it is insisted that the peculiar excellence of the British Constitution lies in a balanced union of three powers. It is said that the monarchical element, the aristocratic element, and the democratic element have each a share in the supreme sovereignty, and that the assent of all three is necessary to the action of that sovereignty. Kings, lords, and commons, by this theory, are alleged to be not only the outward form, but the inner moving essence, the vitality of the Constitution. A great theory, called the theory of checks and balances, pervades an immense part of political literature, and much of it is collected from or supported by English experience. Monarchy, it is said, has some faults, some bad tendencies, aristocracy others, democracy again others. But England has shown that a government can be constructed in which these evil tendencies exactly check balance, and destroy one another, in which a good whole is constructed not simply in spite of, but by means of the counteracting defects of the constituent parts. Accordingly, it is believed that the principal characteristics of the English Constitution, or an aristocracy, do not exist. Oops. Alright. Excuse me, I skipped a line there. Doesn't matter. That constitution is conceived to be the best imaginable use of the political elements which the great majority of states in modern Europe inherited from the medieval period. It is believed that out of these materials, nothing better can be made than the English Constitution. But it is also believed that the essential parts of the English Constitution cannot be made except from these materials. Now, these elements are the accidents of a period and a region. They belong only to 1 or 2 centuries in human history and to a few countries. The United States could not have become monarchical, even if the Constitution Convention had decreed it, even if the component states had ratified it. The mystic reverence, the religious allegiance, which are essential to a true monarchy, are imaginative sentiments that no legislature can manufacture in any people. These semi-filial feelings in government are inherited just as the true filial feelings in common life. You might as well adopt a father as make a monarchy. The special sentiment belonging to the one is as incapable of voluntary creation as the peculiar affection belonging to the other. If the practical part of the English Constitution could only be made out of a curious accumulation of medieval materials, its interests would be half historical and its imitability very confined. No one can approach to an understanding of the English institutions, or of others which, being the growth of many centuries, exercise a wide sway over a mixed population, unless he divide them into 2 classes. In such constitutions, there are 2 parts, not indeed separable with microscopic accuracy, for the genius of great affairs abhors niceties of division. First, those which excite and preserve the reverence of the population, the dignified parts, if I may so call them, and next, the efficient parts, those by which it, in fact, works and rules. There are 2 great objects which every constitution must attain to be successful, which every old and celebrated one must have wonderfully achieved. Every constitution must first gain authority, and then use authority. It must first win the loyalty and confidence of mankind, and then employ that homage in the work of government. There are indeed practical men who reject the dignified parts of government. They say, we only want to attain results, to do business. A constitution is a collection of political means for political ends, and if you admit that any part of a constitution does no business, or that a simpler machine would do equally well what it does, you admit that this part of the Constitution, however dignified or awful it may seem, is nevertheless, in truth, useless. And other reasoners who distrust this bare philosophy have propounded subtle arguments to prove that these dignified parts of old governments are cardinal components of the essential apparatus, great pivots of substantial utility, and so manufactured fallacies which the plainer school have well exposed. But both schools are in error. The dignified parts of government are those which bring it force, which attract its motive power. The efficient parts only employ that power. The comely parts of a government have need, for they are those upon which its vital strength depends. They may not do anything definite that a simpler polity would not do better, but they are the preliminaries, the needful prerequisites of all work. They raise the army, though they do not win the battle. Some more tea. This all speaks to Lizzie, doesn't it? I wonder if Charles can be as dignified as his mother. Doubtless, if all subjects of the same government only thought of what was useful to them, and if they all thought the same thing useful, and all thought that same thing could be attained in the same way, the efficient members of a constitution would suffice, and no impressive adjuncts would be needed. But the world in which we live is organized far otherwise. The most strange fact, though the most certain in nature, is the unequal development of the human race. If we look back to the early age of mankind, such as we seem in the faint distance to see them, if we call up the image of those dismal tribes in lake villages or on wretched beaches, scarcely equal to the commonest material needs, cutting down trees slowly and painfully with stone tools, hardly resisting the attacks of huge, fierce animals, without culture, without leisure, without poetry, almost without thought, destitute of morality, with only a sort of magic for religion. And if we compare that imagined life with the actual life of Europe now, we are overwhelmed at the wide contrast. We can scarcely conceive ourselves to be of the same race as those in the far distance. There used to be a notion, not so much widely asserted as deeply implanted, rather pervadingly latent than commonly apparent in political philosophy, that in a little while, perhaps 10 years or so, all human beings might, without extraordinary appliances, be brought to the same level. Can I just quickly stop here and point out that Walter Bagehot wrote this in, 1860s? 1867. 10 years or so indeed, Walter. But no, this is not Walter Bagehot's own idea, but rather that he's claimed that this was believed in society, right? But now we see by the painful history of mankind at what point we began, by what slow toil, what favorable circumstances, and what accumulated achievements civilized man has become at all worthy in any degree so to call himself. When we realize the tedium of history and the painfulness of results, our perceptions are sharpened as to the relative steps of our long and gradual process. We have in great community like England, crowds of people scarcely more civilized than the majority of 2,000 years ago. I'm just reminded of my time in London. I'm trying not to laugh too loud because obviously this is a bedtime story. So, but still. Yes, let me write this down. What time are we at? 13 minutes. Reminded of my time in London. Okay. Scarcely more civilized than the majority of 2,000 years ago, we have others even more numerous, such as the best people were 1,000 years since. The lower orders, the middle orders, are still, when tried by what is the standard of the educated 10,000, narrow-minded, unintelligent, incurious. It is useless to pile up abstract words. Those who doubt should go out into their kitchens, let an accomplished man try what seems to him most obvious, most certain, most palpable in intellectual matters, upon the housemaid and the footman, and he will find that what he says seems unintelligible, confused, and erroneous, that his audience think him mad and wild when he is speaking what is in his own sphere of thought, the dullest platitude of cautious soberness. Great communities are like great mountains. They have in them the primary, secondary, and tertiary strata of human progress. The characteristics of the lower regions resemble the life of old times rather than the present life of the higher regions. And a philosophy which does not ceaselessly remember, which does not continually obtrude the palpable differences of the various parts will be a theory radically false, because it has omitted a capital reality, will be a theory essentially misleading, because it will lead men to expect what does not exist, and not to anticipate that which they will find. We will talk about this tomorrow, please remember. Every one of these plain facts, but by no means everyone has traced their political importance. When a state is constituted thus, it is not true the lower classes will be absorbed in the useful. They do not like anything so poor. No orator ever made an impression by appealing to men as to their plainest physical wants, except when he could allege or prove that those wants were caused by the tyranny of some other class. Oh, Walter. But thousands have made the greatest impression by appealing to some vague dream of glory or empire or nationality. The ruder sort of men, that is, men at one stage of rudeness, will sacrifice all they hope for, all they have, themselves, for what is called an idea, for some attraction which seems so to transcend reality, which aspires to elevate men by an interest higher, deeper, and wider than that of ordinary life. But this order of men are uninterested in the plain, palpable ends of government. They do not prize them. They do not in the least comprehend how they should be attained. It is very natural, therefore, that the most useful parts of the structure of government should by no means be those which excite the most reverence. The elements which excite the most easy reverence will be the theatrical elements, those which appeal to the senses, which claim to be embodiments of the greatest human idea, which boast in some case of far more than human origin, that which is mystic in its claims, that which is occult in mode of action, that which is brilliant to the eye, that which is seen vividly for a moment and then is seen no more, that which is hidden and unhidden, that which is specious and yet interesting, palpable in its seeming, and yet professing to be more than palpable in its results. This, however, its form may change, or however we may define it or describe it, is the sort of thing, the only sort which yet comes home to the mass of men. So far from the dignified parts of the Constitution being necessarily the most useful, they are likely, according to outside presumption, to be the least so, for they are likely to be adjusted to the lowest orders, those likely to care least and judge worst about what is useful. Let me note this down. 18 minutes. Appeal to states. We will talk about this sometime, because it's particularly apt, right? That Bagehot in 1860 is describing a problem that we're seeing very, very cleanly today. And part of the reason why this problem is seen so cleanly today is the idea of mass communication. We'll talk about that. There we go. Okay. There is another reason, which in an old constitution like that of England is hardly less important. The most intellectual of men are moved quite as much by what they are used to as by what they choose. The active voluntary part of man is very small, and if it were not economized by a sleepy kind of habit, its results would be null. We could not do every day out of our own heads all we have to do. We should accomplish nothing. For all our energies will be frittered away in minor attempts at petty improvement. One man, too, would go off from the known track in one direction and one in another, so that when a crisis comes requiring massed combination, no two men will be near enough to act together. It is the dull traditional habit of mankind that guides most men's actions, and is the steady frame in which each new artist must set the picture that he paints. And all this traditional part of human nature is ex vi termini, most easily impressed and acted on by that which is handed down. Other things being equal, yesterday's institutions are by far the best for today. They are the most ready, the most influential, the most easy to get obeyed, the most likely to retain the reverence which they alone inherit, and which every other must win. The most imposing institutions of mankind are the oldest, and yet so changing is the world, so fluctuating are its needs, so apt to lose inward force, though retaining outward strength, are its best instruments, that we must not expect the oldest institutions to be now the most efficient. We must expect what is venerable to acquire influence because of its inherent dignity, but we must not expect it to use that influence so well as new creations apt for the modern world. Instinct with its spirit and fittingly closely to its life. The brief description of the characteristics merit of the English Constitution is that its dignified parts are very complicated and somewhat imposing, very old and rather venerable, while its efficient parts, at least when in great and critical action, is decidedly simple and rather modern. We have made, or rather stumbled upon, a constitution which, though full of every species of incidental defect, though of the worst workmanship in all out-of-the-way matters of any constitution in the world, yet has two capital merits. It contains a simple, efficient part, which, on occasion and when wanted, can work more simply and easily and better than any instrument of government that has yet been tried. And it contains likewise historical, complex, august, theatrical parts, which it has inherited from a long past, which take the multitude, which guide by an insensible but an omnipotent influence the associations of its subjects. Its essence is strong with the strength of modern simplicity. Its exterior is august with the Gothic grandeur of a more imposing age. Its simple essence may, mutatis mutandis, be transplanted to many very various countries. But its august outside, what most men think it is narrowly confined to nations with an analogous history and similar political relics. Another sip of tea. The efficient secret of the English Constitution may be described as the close union, the nearly complete fusion of the executive and legislative powers. According to the traditional theory, as it exists in all the books, the goodness of our Constitution consists in the entire separation of the legislative and executive authorities. But in truth, its merits consist in their singular approximation. The connecting link is the cabinet. By that new word, we mean a committee of the legislative body selected to be the executive body. The legislature has many committees, but this is its greatest. It chooses for this its main committee, the men in whom it has the most confidence. It does not, it is true, choose them directly, but it is nearly omnipotent in choosing them indirectly. A century ago, the crown had a real choice of ministers, though it had no longer a choice in policy. During the long reign of Sir R. Walpole, he was obliged not only to manage Parliament, but to manage the palace. He was obliged to take care that some court intrigue did not expel him from his place. The nation then selected the English policy, but the crown chose the English ministers. They were not only in the name, as now, but in fact, the Queen's servants. That is Queen Victoria, just so we're clear. Remnants, important remnants of this great prerogative still remain. The discriminating favor of William IV made Lord Melbourne head of the Whig party when he was only one of several rivals, At the death of Lord Palmerston, it is very likely that the Queen may have the opportunity to freely choose between 2, if not 3, statesmen. But as a rule, the nominal Prime Minister is chosen by the legislature, and the real Prime Minister, for most purposes, the leader of the House of Commons, almost without exception, is so. There is nearly always some one man plainly selected by the voice of the predominant party in the predominant house of the legislature to head that party and consequently to rule the nation. We have in England an elective first magistrate as truly as the Americans have an elective first magistrate. The Queen is only at the head of the dignified part of the Constitution. The Prime Minister is the head of the efficient part. The Crown is, according to the saying, the fountain of honor, but the Treasury is the spring of business. Quick note here, the Prime Minister of England is also titled the First Lord of the Treasury. However, our first magistrate differs from the American. He is not elected directly by the people, he is elected by the representatives of the people. He is an example of double election. The legislature chosen in name to make laws, in fact, finds its principal business in making and in keeping an executive. The leading minister so selected has to choose his associates, but he only chooses among a charmed circle. The position of most men in Parliament forbids their being invited to the cabinet. The position of a few men ensures their being invited. Between the compulsory list whom he must make and the impossible list whom he cannot take, a prime minister's independent choice in the formation of a cabinet is not very large. It extends rather to the division of the cabinet offices than to the choice of cabinet ministers. Parliament and the nation have pretty well settled who shall have the first places, but they have not discriminated with the same accuracy which man shall have which place. The highest patronage of a prime minister is, of course, a considerable power, though it is exercised under close and imperative restrictions, though it is far less than it seems to be when stated in theory or looked at from a distance. The cabinet, in a word, is a board of control chosen by the legislature out of persons whom it trusts and knows to rule the nation. The particular mode in which the English ministers are selected, the fiction that they are, in any political sense, the Queen's servants, the rule which limits the choice of the cabinet to the members of the legislature, are accidents unessential to its definition. Historical incidents separable from its nature. Its characteristic is that it should be chosen by the legislature out of persons agreeable to and trusted by the legislature. Naturally, these are principals its own members, but they need not be exclusively so. A cabinet which included persons not members of the legislative assembly might still perform useful duties. Indeed, the peers, who constitute a large element in modern cabinets, are members, nowadays, only of a subordinate assembly. The House of Lords still exercises several useful functions, but the ruling influence, the deciding faculty, has passed to what, using the language of old-timers, we still call the lower house, to an assembly which, though inferior as a dignified institution, is superior as an efficient institution. A principal advantage of the House of Lords in the present age indeed consists in its thus acting as a reservoir of cabinet ministers. Unless the composition of the House of Commons were improved, or unless the rules requiring cabinet ministers to be members of the legislature were relaxed, it would undoubtedly be difficult to find, without the Lords, a sufficient supply of chief ministers. But the detail of the composition of a cabinet and the precise method of its choice are not the purpose now. The first and cardinal consideration is the definition of a cabinet. We must not bewilder ourselves with the separable accidents until we know the necessary essence. A cabinet is a combining committee, a hyphen, which joins a buckle which fastens the legislative part of the state to the executive part of the state. In its origin, it belongs to the one, in its function, it belongs to the other. The most curious point about the cabinet is that so very little is known about it. The meetings are not only secret in theory, but secret in reality. By the present practice, no official minute is kept of them. Even a private note is discouraged and disliked. The House of Commons, even in its most inquisitive and turbulent moments, would not permit a note of a cabinet meeting to be read. No minister who respected the fundamental usages of political practice would attempt to read such a note. The committee, which unites the lawmaking power of the law to the law executing power, which, by the virtue of that combination, is, while it lasts and holds together, the most powerful body in the state, is a committee wholly secret. No description of it at once graphic and authentic has ever been given. It is said to be sometimes like a rather disorderly board of directors, where many speak and few listen, but no one knows. Obviously, today it is different. But fundamentally not quite so different. But a cabinet, though it is a committee of the Legislative Assembly, is a committee with a power which no assembly would, unless for historical accidents and after happy experience, have been persuaded to entrust to any committee. It is a committee which can dissolve the assembly which appointed it. It is a committee with a suspensive veto, a committee with the power of appeal. Though appointed by one parliament, it can appeal if it chooses to the next. Theoretically, indeed, the power to dissolve parliament is entrusted to the sovereign only, and there are only vestiges of doubt whether in all cases a sovereign is bound to dissolve parliament when the cabinet asks him to do so. But neglecting such small and dubious exceptions, the cabinet which has chosen by one House of Commons has an appeal to the next House of Commons. The chief committee of the legislature has the power of dissolving the predominant part of that legislature. In fact, on critical occasions, the legislature itself. The English system, therefore, is not an absorption of the executive power by the legislative, it is a fusion of the two. Either the cabinet legislate and act, or, if not, it can dissolve. It is a creature, but it has the power of destroying its creators. It is an executive which can annihilate the legislative as well as an executive which is the nominee of the legislature. It was made, but it can unmake. It was derivative in its origin, but it is destructive in its action. And here we come to the end of the first part of the English Constitution. We've commented on a few things, and I've read quite a few comments. We will have to address them in a future podcast. So I just want to say thank you very much for watching. In conclusion, please download Firefox, please don't do Chrome, and have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, night, wherever you are. Good night.